welcome everybody to the inaugural CSOL Academy. My name is Emanuel Ubet. I'm an assistant professor at Rotterdam School of Management at Erasmus University. If you've not already done so, I kindly ask you to turn on your video and mute yourself. Before we start, let me, thank greatly the co-organizer, Jose Arrieta, who's really been like the driving force behind the scenes here. He set up all the kind of digital environment, really all the way we interacting with each other. Let me also thank David, who's here, David Maslach, and Daniela Laureo Martinez. I don't know if she's here, I haven't seen her. Who run the overarching kind of CSOL organization and annual conference every summer. I think, David, you mentioned that there's still spots available for the in-person kind of conference in Aziloma, which is like a super beautiful spot in California. The in-person conference will take place, I think it's August 10th to 13th. So just after the AUM. So there is still spots available. So please, if you're inspired, register. There's also still spots, I think, to present your work more formally. So please do that. And then last but not least, let me also thank Phanish and John Joseph, who've also been like instrumental, in helping setting up the entire conference, and without whose help, there would have been no way we could have gathered such an illustrious, set of speakers and faculty participants. So today we'll start with the seminar by Phanish Puranam. He's a shared professor at INSEAD and based on their Singapore campus. Today, Phanish will talk about learning aggregation, but I strongly urge you to check out his fantastic other work, not least his most recent 2018 book, The Microstructures of Organizations, right, Phanish? Which is a fantastic book, very clarifying, and I think in which aggregation really plays a central role as well. And with that, Phanish, I'll just hand it over to you. I've made you a co-host so you can share anything you want. Thank you so much. Like a early round of applause already for Phanish. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's very kind. Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Jose. And thank you, Dave and Daniela for being receptive to this suggestion to launch this academy that John and I made almost like a year back, I guess. It's a great honor to be kicking this series off. I'm very pleased to be here, and I hope to talk to you for about an hour and a half, inclusive of various points where we'll stop and take questions and so on. I'm going to be talking to you about learning aggregation, or to subtitle what it is I'm going to do, I'm really going to tackle the question about what is organizational about organizational learning, right? In particular, what's different about learning by individuals versus learning by organizations. And that's where the aggregation question comes in. So that's really at the heart of what I want to talk about. Just a little bit of background before I sketch out the agenda and what I plan to do. Broadly speaking, across literatures, learning is simply a change in beliefs and behavior through experience. Right? This is a standard definition in any textbook on psychology that you might open. And in our field, in organizational science, I use the term organizational science very broadly here to cover various theories within that, whether it's institutional theory or whether it's ecology or organizational design work or transaction cost. It's really the science of how organizations work. Within this field, I think, or within this domain, there are at least these three major literatures in which learning is very central. So there's the organizational learning curves literature, which Linda is going to talk to you in more depth about later. And in fact, I spent in preparation for my talk this weekend looking at everybody's videos. And it was super educational for me as well. I know some of this stuff, but it's always good to go back and refresh your fundamentals. So I know that she's coming soon to talk to you about organizational learning curves. There's the modeling literature in which Dan Leventhal, a mentor and a teacher of mine, and who's going to be coming next today right after me, has been very foundational in his work, both in setting up frameworks to model search on NK landscapes, as well as learning in multi-armed bandits in his work with Hartposen and others. So there's that entire tradition on organizational learning. And one of the things I'll do today is kind of distinguish sharply between search and learning. In what ways are these the same? In what ways are these different? There's another tradition of work, which is on performance feedback. And this is very much driven by my colleague here at INSEAD, Henrik Greve. And all three of them are essentially Carnegie tradition people. And two of them also have a strong Stanford connection, Dan and Henrik. And it's been my great pleasure actually to be associated with all three of them in one form or the other, and having been mentored by them in various ways. So enormous traditions of literature in each of these ways of thinking about organizational learning. But one common weakness, having praised them, now it's time to make some critical comments. One common weakness, if you like, of this entire set of traditions is they've largely treated organizations as a unitary actor, okay, as a single entity. And this can be traced back at least to Syed and March's famous work in 1963, The Behavioral Theory of the Firm. There's a lot of discussion about coalitions, about politics, about contestation, multiple actors. But when you get to the most precise expression of the theory, which is usually the model, it is really a single agent which is doing its stuff in the task environment, right? It's learning from feedback and it's searching probabilistically and so on. Increasingly, I think there's a growing recognition in our field that there are important qualitative differences between organizational and individual learning, okay? And one important reason we must recognize this difference and do something about it is that if you were to stop at description, okay, it might be fine to think about organizations as unitary actors. But most of us, if not all of us, also have a job in a business school, which means we have some normative responsibilities, right? Partly we are also engineers. We're trying to improve the way organizations work. And it's very hard to do that with a unitary actor model of the organization, right? Because whatever is going on inside, which is what you would usually intervene on in terms of process or structure, if that's all assumed to be black box, then we have no basis for making strong normative claims. So thinking about organizations as multi-actor systems and thinking about aggregation, I think is a very important next step in our transition in this field. And I think there's a rapid progress in the last decade in the theory side, particularly on the computational modeling front, to study how aggregation affects learning. The empirical work has not quite kept pace. Okay, so this is really one of my main points that I want to drive home today, that I think there's a lot one can do in this space empirically, if only just to test these models, but to really extend and enrich them. Okay, and there's really enormous opportunities here to start thinking empirically about how do we understand organizational learning as the aggregation of the learning processes of its members, right? This is something that it's intuitive to all of us, but it's kind of surprising how little we have by way of large sample empirical work or even careful qualitative work. It's not a null set, by the way. There are some great papers that do this, but far fewer in number compared to the number of theory papers and modeling papers that have really kind of exploded over the last decade. Beyond the empirical tests of these theories, I also think that, if we are a little bit forward-looking and ask what are the interesting organizational phenomena that are occurring today in the world and which we are called upon to pronounce as theorists and experts on organizational science, among the few that come immediately to mind are things like agile teams, human-AI collaboration, the metaverse, and decentralized autonomous organizations. So many of these today are roughly at the status of being buzzwords, but they won't be like that for long, right? These things will become quite real, quite fast, in my view. Well, how fast will vary by the particular phenomenon. Agile teams has already become very prevalent across various sectors and industries. And for each one of these phenomena, I think there is something we can say as organizational learning experts that nobody else can. Okay, there is a strong organizational learning component to these phenomena. And in particular, I think the most interesting things we can say about these phenomena from an organizational learning perspective require us to think about aggregation, not to treat organization as single unitary entities, right? So just think about agile teams, for example, right? Agile teams are teams that are essentially learning as they're doing. And to think about the aggregation of how these team members are both learning and coordinating at the same time, we have to think aggregation. If you think about human-AI collaboration, this is really, again, the aggregation of learning by a human and learning by a machine, right? Which are both receiving feedback and are dynamically updating their own thinking. You think about the metaverse, where people are kind of collaborating in various incarnations through avatars, through virtual reality. The kind of social learning we'll see in these contexts is probably going to be quite different from what one might see face to face. And we don't fully know the space of those differences and those similarities. Or think about decentralized autonomous organizations which build off blockchain and use consensus very heavily to make governance decisions. So how those consensus forming groups change their behavior over time as they adapt to repeated voting rounds. These are all really org learning questions. And I think we have something to say as long as we're willing to adapt aggregation view and think of an organization as a collection of actors rather than a single unitary actor. So this is the reason why I think focusing on aggregation is important. And that's why I picked this topic to contribute to the CSOL Academy. Okay. In terms of agenda and format for how I'm going to do the rest of this talk, like all Zoom classes, it's not going to be one of those things where we can have a real-time conversation as effectively as if you were in the same room. But what I do intend to do is pause in every 5 to 10 minutes or so and invite some questions. And I do invite you as we go along to put any clarification questions or comments in chat. I can't see all of them as I talk, but fortunately attending this session are two of our students from INSEAD, Ekin Ilseven and Sangyun Park. And both of them were, in fact, teaching assistants for a class I very recently ran on modeling organizational learning. And I think you have actually access to those videos as preparation for today's session as well. So they're very experienced in dealing with all the questions that come about from my inaccurate ways of talking. So they are well versed in being able to respond to questions that arise from that source. And anything else that looks like urgent or important, they will flag for me, but I will also pause and take questions, okay? So that's kind of the format. And we'll probably leave a bit more time towards the end for a more open discussion. I have 3 broad things to cover. So firstly, I want to talk about individual learning by doing, okay? And I want to spend a significant amount of time on that, which might strike you as odd, given, I just opened by saying we have to talk about not individual, but multi-actor learning systems. That's true. But to get to that, we have to have really clear understanding of individual learning by doing. And I'm going to introduce this notion of a learning cycle, which is prevalent in the literature, but we're going to use it in a particular way as, if you like, the basic building block that will help us go from individual to group learning. Okay? And I think it's actually a very elegant way of thinking of many past traditions of literature in terms of the learning cycle, and also gives us a very sharp way of thinking about what really changes when you go from one actor to multiple actors, right? What exactly is the aggregation process that's happening there? We'll then move on to the actual question of aggregation itself. And I'm going to make the point basically that aggregation is interesting only because it's not a simple sum, right? A simple sum is also an aggregation. So I can literally add up what lots of people are doing. And if I can simply add them up arithmetically, that's a form of aggregation. But the reason aggregation in organizations is usually more interesting than that is it's not really a simple sum. And it's not a simple sum for precisely one important reason. There are complex interactions between the actors. Okay? And in particular, in organizations, we can decompose interactions into 2 basic types: interdependence and influence. And these are quite different things. Sometimes we will mix these up, but we shouldn't. And what I'm going to show you is that if you can think about interactions across the learning cycles of individuals in terms of interdependence and influence, it will give us a very clear sense of what exactly do we mean by aggregation, why is it important, how is it going to produce different behavior compared to that of a single individual. Along those lines, I'll talk a little bit about unified versus distributed action in groups. So committees versus teams, they learn differently, right? Committees have multiple actors, but in the end, they make one decision. In a team, every actor independently acts on the task environment. And this is important. This turns out to be quite significant in thinking about how these different kinds of groups will learn. And finally, I'll close with something that, to be honest, I don't know much about, in the sense we've just really started studying this. And there are a few other papers doing this, but I think this is a really exciting space for further research, which is to try and disentangle aggregation from context effects. Okay, and I'll explain that in detail, but the gist of it is you're going to see some differences between an individual learning on their own, alone, versus in a group, partly because the inputs to the individual come from the group. That's aggregation. But you're also going to see, because we are humans and not algorithms, or not pure machines, or pure mechanical algorithms at least, or at least not simple algorithms, we also tend to change the way we learn just because we are in a social context. Okay, and these 2 things are really the reason why in aggregate organizational learning is different from individual learning. So to come back to the starting question, what is organizational about organizational learning? The answer, in my view, is because of aggregation and context effects. Okay, and parsing these apart, I think we've just begun doing this, and it's not an easy thing to do, but I think there are interesting opportunities here to explore this further. So with that as the agenda and the plan, let me jump into it. And I do want to make sure there's one caveat on the table. the perspective I'm giving you on organization learning is very much the perspective of primarily a theorist. That's what I mostly do. I do some empirical work, but I think mostly I do theory. And in particular, a theorist who uses some formalization for their theory, right? So that means that comes with its pros and cons. So the cons are obvious, right? It can be somewhat abstract and stark and very simplified, guilty as charged, but hopefully there are some pros as well, right? And the most important pro, I think, is precision and clarity. So if nothing else, you might think about the way I'm offering of thinking about organizational learning and aggregation as a basic set of tools which can be quite simple and stark, but will be at least a good null hypothesis for you to use when you actually confront the reality of complex organizations. Okay, so I'm not vested in the idea that the world is as simple as my models. In fact, it's not, right? And I want to make my models simple so my poor little brain can understand them. But that's perfectly fine because I think it gives us a good platform to start with. And then we can add complexity as we get into the real world and start understanding what's going on. Okay, so this is the reason why this caveat is important. It's one perspective and it comes from a model. So, do with that as you will. Okay, individual learning cycles and individual learning by doing. So let's start with something that I call the Robinson Crusoe model of learning. So I don't know if this generation still reads Robinson Crusoe, but this is about the guy who gets shipwrecked on an island and is all alone, right? And economists use the parable of Robinson Crusoe to think about an economy with one actor, where there are no gains from trade. And borrowing from that, we can think about the Robinson Crusoe model of learning, where there's just one actor in a little task environment, right? And this actor has some goals. He wants to maybe find himself on the highest peak here. But obviously, they have some beliefs about this task environment. They represent it in some way in their head. And they take some choices based on that representation, based on should I go this way, should I go this way, should I go this way? And the first important point to make here is that if their understanding of the world was perfect, there is no role for learning. Okay, so learning only matters because we don't begin with a perfect understanding of the task environment we live in, right? If we did, then there is no role for learning. So learning is our primary tool, if you like, to combat ignorance. So we don't begin with a perfect understanding of the world we are in, and we probably never end with it either, but we improve our understanding of the world, which is we change our representations and beliefs through learning, right? That's why learning is so central to what we do. So imagine this one single actor and who's trying to figure out how to get to a good outcome in this task environment. That's the goal, has some beliefs about it, and is taking some choices about how to move around in this world. In this world now, what this actor is doing over time is individual learning by doing. Okay, this is simply, in short, learning by doing or learning from own experience or decisions from experience. These are all synonyms for the same phenomena. But the core of it is a cyclical iterative process where you take actions based on your beliefs. You have some understanding of the world, you take some actions based on that. You receive some feedback from the task environment that tells you something about how good or bad your efforts were in terms of performance. And as a consequence, you change your beliefs and behaviors, right? That's learning. Learning is a change in beliefs or behaviors as a consequence of experience. So what is experience here? Experience is the historical record of your past actions and outcomes. Okay, this is at the very core of individual learning by doing. And we can represent this very simple process where you have an actor, Robinson Crusoe, has a belief structure about the world, is taking action based on that, gets feedback, changes beliefs, and continues again and again. And we can represent that by a learning cycle. Okay? So this is a very simple elementary building block for everything that comes later in this talk. The learning cycle is an iterative sequence where you go from beliefs to actions to outcomes, and then you update your beliefs again, and then you take actions and you get outcomes, and so on and so on and so on. Right? That's learning by doing. This is really central to everything else that comes later, because in this very simple picture of beliefs, actions, and outcomes, there's actually a lot going on, which is not shown in this very simple picture. Right? And the action is really hidden in the arrows. So if you think about what lies between outcomes and beliefs, what's happening here? So this is updating, right? This is thinking, this is memory, this is cognition, this recombination, if you like. So what's happening between beliefs and actions, right? That's really the process where you do things like creativity, like improvisation, which Anne Miner is going to talk about later, right? Things like exploration, things like search, right? Local search, distant search. All of those things are occurring between the beliefs and the actions part of this diagram. And then from the actions, again, you get the outcomes, which is really a property of the task environment, which in the case of Robinson Crusoe is just him and the world. But very soon, once we introduce other actors in the system so that you get social learning, we're going to start seeing that the link between my action and my outcome is also going to depend in many circumstances on what other actors are doing, right? That's where we start seeing social and vicarious and coupled learning. And we'll elaborate on each one of these things and see how they're different from each other. But at the core of all of that is the simple learning cycle idea that goes from beliefs to actions to outcomes. Now, different literatures, okay, in our tradition, in our field, have emphasized different aspects of this learning cycle. So there's a very nice 2020 paper by Linda Argotti and Sun Hughes here and colleagues, which has really reviewed 20, 30 years of extensive organizational learning literature. And they pointed out that there are different strands of work, okay, which tackle different parts of this learning cycle. For instance, here you have the literature on things like memory, on retention, on codification, and later you'll hear Willie Ocasio and John Joseph talk about attention. So these are processes that lie somewhere between outcomes and beliefs being updated in various forms. There's a literature on aspirations. Henrik Greve is going to talk about this later, which is really a way of changing your beliefs as a function of your outcomes, right? So do you feel that you can do better? Do you think you're doing well enough? And as a consequence of that, you might then see a transfer of beliefs between actors within an organization, between organizations. That's all the transfer stuff. Between beliefs and actions, there's a whole lot of interesting stuff around creation, being creative, recombining beliefs, exploring the limits of them, improvising on them. And of course, most importantly for a modeler, there's the entire exploration and search angle to this problem, which is given your beliefs, to what extent do you act strictly according to them, which is exploitation, or do you sometimes take actions that are inconsistent with your current beliefs, which is exploration, right? Or alternatively, given your beliefs, do you try to explore a different part of the alternative space, which is very far away from where you are, that is distant search? Or do you stick in your local neighborhood and try to look for small improvements in the domain of where you are, that is local search, right? So these very different literatures have all focused on different arrows, if you like, or different parts of the arrow, in fact, and have expanded or have zoomed in or zoomed out depending on what they're primarily interested in, right? But what is uniting all of them in some very important sense is the idea that at the core of it is always this basic cycle of going at the individual level from beliefs to actions to outcomes, okay? And the literature which has treated organizations as unitary entities, even if there are multiple members in them, has of course talked a lot about these processes internal to the firm, internal to the organization. But what I want to do is to take you from the individual to the group in a very systematic step-by-step way. So you can see exactly what changes when you start aggregating and you start going from an individual to the group. So this is like a map of what's coming. Now, since I mentioned exploration and search, right, I want to distinguish here between search and learning quite sharply. So what is search? Search is the generation and evaluation of new alternatives, okay? So, and what alternatives are available at a given point depends on the past alternatives. So there's kind of this dependence in states across time. Learning, on the other hand, as we've defined, is just a change in beliefs and behavior through experience. So this has one very interesting implication, right? One can have learning without search. I may not generate any new alternatives. I have all the alternatives that exist. I just don't know their value and which is better and worse. And I learn that by trying them out. But the contrary is not true. You cannot have search without learning. Right? Whenever you're searching, when you're looking for new alternatives, you are learning about the value of that alternative. You cannot escape that. So there can be no search without learning, but there can be learning without search. Okay, so this distinction is kind of useful. And sometimes we use the term exploration in kind of an equivalent sense between the two, but they mean quite different things, at least when we model these formally and think about learning in a multi-armed bandit framework, for instance. Exploration means quite precisely something which is taking actions inconsistent with current beliefs, right? Whereas exploration in a search context often refers to things like how big is the jump you're making from your current location to somewhere else, right? So in one case, it is the extent to which you discard your current belief, and the other, it is the extent to which you move in some space of alternatives quite far versus quite proximately where you are. I'll come to questions in 1 second. Okay. So one last point I want to make about the learning cycle, and then we'll pause and take some questions and clarification. Given that this individual learning cycle or learning by doing process is quite fundamental to organizational learning as well, it shouldn't surprise us that it's also fundamental in other disciplines which are quite unconnected with organizations, right? In fact, the individual learning by doing model is also very fundamental in machine learning, and it's called reinforcement learning. Okay, this is exactly a one-to-one match to what we call individual learning by doing. Is reinforcement? It's a particular kind of reinforcement learning in machine learning, and partly from that literature and partly from our own, we know that whether the learner is really an individual, it's literally Robinson Crusoe, or it's an organization which acts like an individual, there are going to be some predictable trade-offs in this learning cycle that they will have to solve. Okay, so what are these trade-offs? There's the exploration exploitation trade-off. I've already mentioned that, right? So as you are learning by doing iteratively, at each stage you have to ask yourself, do I go with my current best beliefs or do I take actions inconsistent with that? Why would I ever do that? Because my beliefs might not be accurate, right? If I strictly did what my beliefs told me is the best thing to do, I might never discover better alternatives, given that my beliefs are not accurate. But each time I do that, right, there's a risk that I'm actually discarding the useful information in my belief structure. So Yerker Donrel gives this great example in one of his papers about, I have some beliefs about which restaurants in my neighborhood are good and bad, okay? Now, those might not be perfect. If I just stick to them, I might never discover better restaurants. But if I occasionally explore, I go to some random restaurant which I don't have any clear beliefs about, or I even think they're not going to be that good, but let me try it. Most of the time you're eating some bad meals, okay? But once in a while, you're going to find some really amazing restaurant. That's the point of exploration. So we have to make this trade-off between exploration and exploitation whenever we are in these learning cycles. So that's one fundamental trade-off. If you're thinking about learning along with search, where you're generating alternatives, there's a similar trade-off between local and distant search. So if I stick locally, I can make some local improvements. I kind of know that I can refine things and get to a local peak for sure. But it might just be a local peak. Whereas if I'm willing to gamble and take a long jump, do something quite different, quite crazy, most of the time I probably do worse, right? And the more rugged the landscape, probably the worse I do. But if I didn't make these long leaps, I'm never going to discover or improve upon the peaks that I already have. So that's one very important trade-off as well. And the third trade-off, which is again very well understood in machine learning, a little less explicit in our literature, but I think some forms of it exist, is really the trade-off between over and under generalization. Okay, and this is called the bias variance trade-off. And it shows up in something called supervised learning in machine learning, which is really just this part of the cycle. So in supervised learning, there is no action. Okay, you're just given a set of outcomes and some beliefs about what produces them, and you have to learn from that outcomes and the beliefs some causal structure or some associational structure between cues and outcomes. Okay, so a typical example would be a regression model is a case of supervised learning. All right, and when we fit models like regression models to the data or do Q learning, to use Felipe Chazar's language, the risk we run is that we might be fitting not just the signal in the data, but also the noise. Okay, so we want to make sure that we are not overfitting the data. At the same time, we don't want to underfit the data. So this trade-off between overfitting and underfitting the data, or overgeneralizing or undergeneralizing from the data, is called the bias variance trade-off. And these three basic trade-offs about bias variance, exploration, exploitation, local and distant search, are just endemic to any learning system which is going through these learning cycles. Whether that system is one person, whether it's a group, it doesn't really matter. If you are learning, you are facing these basic generic trade-offs. Okay, so let me pause there and take a few questions. So should I look at chat, or would you just like to unmute yourself and jump in?
I think it's maybe easiest if people just unmute themselves, if that's okay with Phanish. There's not too many.
Perfectly, please go ahead.
All right, so just go ahead and then.
Okay, Phanish, thank you so much for sharing your insights. It's been already helpful a lot. So I have a couple of questions. First question is, in your describing the cycle, the model that you showed, there was the word of representation and there was beliefs, and I'm sort of, I think they're the same thing, but I just wanted to sort of get clarification what actually the representation is versus the beliefs. And the second question is, on your definition on search and learning. I think there was a similar question in the chat. So I'm sort of thinking about this empirically, right? How would I measure search versus learning? And it seems like both constructs are, it could be measurable, but it could not. Maybe it's not, right? Like, because you say generation and evaluation of new alternatives that may be visible to outsiders. Maybe it's not, right? And in the learning, you say it's changing beliefs and behavior. So maybe the change in behavior may be measurable, but the change in beliefs may not be measurable. So how do we think about this in terms of sort of empirically, actually in a real world setting? How do they sort of come to life, right? That's sort of my question. Thank you.
Okay, so we're clear on the beliefs and representations question, right? They're the same thing. So I'm using them identically here. So let me take a corporate example, okay? So think about corporate headquarters in a multi-business company. So they have different divisions, and each of these divisions every year is asking for capital budgeting, and the CEO has to make a decision on how much to invest in each one of these. So learning about the profitability of opportunities in each division by investing in them, that's learning by doing. That is learning, right? Creating a new division or a skunk works or coming up with a completely new business line is search. It's a new alternative. So empirically, this is one way we might distinguish between the two. So we are learning about the value of a known set of alternatives versus we are extending the set of alternatives. Okay, so these are like sharp cases where the two are quite different. There is a gray zone, okay, like with many of these things. So it may be that I always knew about these possibilities, but I just never thought they were very interesting. Now, is that search now or is it learning, right? So that becomes a bit of a gray zone. But the sharp cases are quite clear. So if you're doing something quite new, you're exploring something quite new as an alternative, we would really think of that as some kind of a alternative generation process and therefore a search process, which always embeds learning, because when you create that new alternative, you're going to learn about its value. Or you might have an existing set of alternatives and you're just learning about their value by investing in them and by doing, essentially, right? So this is one way to distinguish the two empirically. Make sense?
Yeah. So the change in behavior in terms of learning is actually something bigger than search. Is that what it is? So
learning is always a change in beliefs and behavior, right? And if you can't observe beliefs, you might not be able to observe learning completely, right? If you can observe behavior, you can be sure learning has occurred. But even if with no change in behavior, it's possible learning has occurred because beliefs have changed, right? So that becomes a measurement challenge for you to then resolve whether you're able to actually measure it or not.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Phanish.
Sure. Who's next? Ekaterina, is that you? You want to go next?
Well, I could go next. I don't know.
You pop up in the top of my list, so I'm
yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Phanish, for the start of the lecture. Really interesting. And my first question. Yeah, I posted it actually in the chat. It's so you say that learning is bigger than search, and could you please repeat again the example when learning happens without search? Yeah.
Okay, so if learning is simply updating your beliefs or behavior based on experience, right? That can happen even when the set of alternatives is already fixed. Mm-hmm. So like in my example, if I'm in 10 lines of business in my multi-business company and I stay in 10 lines of business, I could be learning each period about the relative attractiveness of these divisions through my return on investment. That's just learning. There's not necessarily any search here. But suppose I were to add new lines of business or enter new lines of business or acquire a new line of business, then there is some search going on as well. And search is always accompanied by learning, whereas learning can occur without any search. That was the distinction I was drawing.
Mm-hmm. I see now. The other question which I have is related to searching and applying that knowledge that you obtain or that information. So when like search becomes, turns into application of that knowledge and information into what you are doing. So you are saying that it should be a certain change in behavior, in actions that agents take. And I have this question, do we have literature about this like translation of search into activities, into application of knowledge and information?
Absolutely. And I think, so in fact, the keywords that I have here, if you look at these literatures, right? So literature on memory, on retention, on codification, on attention. These are all essentially looking at the processes that lie between the outcomes of your actions through search and your new beliefs, your new understanding of the world. So these are all processes that lie between the outcomes you receive as a consequence of your search actions or your exploration actions and your new understanding of the world, which in turn leads to further sets of actions. So there are multiple literatures which try to ask what happens when learners take the feedback they get from their task environment and then process it in some way and then act further on it. So there isn't one, there are probably multiple literatures that are trying to answer exactly that question. Okay.
So it's memory, retention, codification, attention will be the keywords for me to search.
Correct.
To
Correct.
search.
And in fact, many of the speakers in this academy are going to be focusing just on individual pieces here. Right. So Willie Ocasio, for example, is going to spend a lot of time talking about attention. Right. Anne Miner later is going to talk about improvisation and creation, which comes later in the cycle. So these are vast literatures. All I'm doing is giving you what's at a very basic level, a common way of tying these different things together by thinking in terms of a learning cycle.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sure. Mario.
Hi, Phanish. Great to see you again, and great to have an opportunity to learn even more from you. So this is a very long-standing confusion on my part, and you seem to, when you described search and exploitation, you seem, what I could take from that was that they're pretty close. And when I read March 1991 a long time back, I have a very hard time distinguishing between local search, distance search, and exploration. And the way you described it, exploration is breaking with your current beliefs, right? Mm-hmm. But I tie that, and I hope you can help me out here. I talked to Willie Ocasio about this a number of times, and I still can't really wrap my head around it. But in my mind, they're sort of the same. And I'm probably wrong, but exploration, breaking with current beliefs, in my mind, it's you explore, when there's a negative attainment discrepancy. So you've already sort of broken with those current beliefs. But that's probably, again, my misunderstanding of on the one hand, local distance search and exploration. So do you see a clear distinction between those two?
We do. And to be honest, we also have only begun to recognize this clearly in the modeling community relatively recently. Okay. But I think where it becomes very sharply separable is we think about these two broad classes of models of organizational learning in our field. Think about multi-armed bandit type models where, there's a fixed set of alternatives. I'm taking different actions. Their exploration is very sharply defined. It's defined as at any given period, am I going to take actions that are consistent with my current beliefs about the attractiveness of the actions? Or with some probability, am I going to try something different? Right? So that's exploration. It's very sharply defined in that world.
Regardless of performance feedback then, right?
That's linked to it. So performance feedback is interestingly not exactly that either. It's a third kind of model. Then there's the NK world where they have search on rugged landscapes, where clearly there's a sense of searching locally versus searching far away. Right? So distance and ignoring your current beliefs are conceptually not the same thing. And these two models can capture it very differently. Okay. But of course, in empirical applications or in a very abstract sense, when we are lumping in them together, it's fair to say that exploration can stand in a shorthand way for doing something that is risky currently to what you're doing, relative to what you're doing, right? So it's going to be risky either because you're ignoring your current beliefs or it's going to be risky because you're taking a long jump. But these are two different conceptualizations of the notion of exploration. Okay. Right? That's one way to think about it. I would recommend reading a paper, quite recent one by Stefan Billinger and Kanan Shrikant and others, where it's an SMJ, it's an empirical paper with an experimental data. They've done a great job reviewing the literature and making this confusion actually very salient, that we have used these terms in sort of interchangeable ways, but they don't mean exactly the same thing. They mean slightly different things. And because they're using lab, they can actually measure these things differently as well. Okay. And show that these can be even operationalized differently. So I think that's a great resource to look for.
Thank you.
Sangyul, I reckon if you remember the reference, kindly throw it in the chat so that everybody can access it. Right, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, Norman?
Thank you, Phanish. It's very helpful. But the question that I have in my mind is like, when you talk about aggregation, how do you differentiate about it from processing? I mean, information aggregation. So when we go from individual to the group level or team level, apart from just aggregation of information, or do you think that processing is subsumed under aggregation, or is it something different? Or how do you differentiate it? And when we observe the outcome, can we call it an outcome of aggregation or processing?
So I will use that word aggregation in the specific sense when there are more than one actor. So any processing happening within a single actor, I don't call that aggregation. Though of course, you could think of that as a kind of information aggregation inside one mind. But just to be clear, I will not use the word aggregation unless more than one actor is on the stage. So far, there's not been more than one actor. So I've said nothing about aggregation yet. We're getting there, right? So in a couple of slides, if I'm not there, please remind me again.
Okay.
Right? Sure. Andrea.
Hi, Phanish. Thank you. Thank you. This was really helpful. So this is also a bit in the sort of along the lines of some of the previous questions, but I'm kind of relatively new to a lot of this work. And when you talk about learning, sort of you assumed essentially that learning happens through experience. And so I was curious if you had any thoughts on, are there ways to learn that happens without experience? Sort of, I guess, in other words, are there learning processes that are sort of equally effective but are different from learning by doing?
So yes, so let me distinguish these two very sharply. All learning has to happen by experience because that's the definition, right? Learning is a change in belief or behavior as a consequence of experience. So far, I've been talking about the special case of learning from own experience or learning by doing, right? I'm going to now, in a second, introduce the idea of learning from others' experience, which is social learning or vicarious learning or things like that, right? So there is a way to learn without having accumulated the experience yourself, but ultimately somebody must have accumulated that experience, right? The only way that an agent who doesn't start already with a full understanding of the world can understand the world is by learning, which means through accumulating experience, either on their own or the experience of others. So I cannot think of learning without experience, but I can think of learning without your own experience. Hopefully that answers your question. Make sense?
Yeah, can I very briefly follow up on that? Sort of, as I think about, we're looking at individual learning, us going through middle school or high school and things like that. So we were reading sort of books about biology or math or whatever. Would you still call that learning through experience or not, basically?
Yes, it is, because essentially what you're doing is you're either learning from the experience of others, which have been codified into a set of beliefs that are transferred to you, or there are things you learn through practice, right? So how do we learn to do long division? We do it by learning by doing. We try, we fail, we get feedback, we get better at it. So it is always learning, learning is always from experience, whether the experience is your own, created through learning by doing, or is encapsulated and fed to you by a teacher, right? Which comes directly into this part here on the beliefs. That can vary, but ultimately it is always going to come from experience. It's actually essentially a version of the philosophical position called empiricism. We only know about the world by interacting with it and learning about it by acting in it, right? It may just be that it's not you doing the interaction, somebody else is doing it for you, but somebody's got to do it. It doesn't come platonically formed in our mind from birth. That's really the point. Okay, great. Julia.
Hi, thanks for giving this talk, Phanish. And this is particularly helpful to me because I have zero knowledge about organizational learning. So in the slide, I like you use supervised machine learning as an example to show how organizational learning is different from individual learning. But there are other types of machine learning, yes. Such as unsupervised machine learning and reinforcement learning. So how did you see these two types of machine learning fit into this graph, particularly reinforcement learning, because it kind of like generally defined how a machine learns to act in an environment. So yeah, maybe you would talk about this in your other slides. So yeah, just wondering, how did you see these other two types learning fit into this graph?
Yeah. So the full cycle here, Julia, which goes from beliefs to actions to outcomes and iterates, is individual learning by doing, is exactly the same thing as reinforcement learning. So the full cycle is reinforcement learning. In fact, we model individual learning by doing in organizational science, typically using reinforcement learning models. And it's the same model structure as what's used in computer science, right? It's the same sort of basic. It's a particular kind of reinforcement learning model called temporal differencing, which we use all the time in our work. But the point I was making here is, if you did not have a process of acting and you only relied on looking at the relationship between outcomes and forming beliefs, this is equivalent to supervised learning, right? So if somebody just gave you a data set with a bunch of outcomes and you had to find the relationships between them and form your beliefs based on that, that's supervised learning, like fitting a regression model to your data, right? But if you had to form your outcomes from your own actions, and you had to do that iteratively, that is reinforcement learning. So both classes of machine learning algorithms are also present here. What is not present here is unsupervised learning, which I think we'll have to deal with separately. But they are the other two classes of machine learning are very much present in this idea of a learning cycle. The links that you would have gotten along with the preparatory material for this class is actually a full course on modeling organization learning. And one of the sections is actually on machine versus organization learning, where I go into these things in a lot more technical detail. So if you're interested in those things, please do look there. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So let's move on to aggregation. So far the action has been all at the level of one actor, right? So it's a very simple world. It's Robinson Crusoe who's going through these cycles of learning by doing. So beliefs, actions, outcomes, and keep updating that and so on. Okay. Now, what's going to happen if we make the model a little bit more complicated by throwing in a second actor? Okay. In other words, we want to now study what happens because of aggregation. And to understand aggregation, as I said, it's only interesting because there's something more happening than the simple sum. And something more is happening than the simple sum because of structure, right? What's happening in organization is structure. What is structure? Structure is just stable patterns of interaction, which can be either formal through authority, or it can be informal through some kind of emergent processes like social networks or culture or things like that. But in all cases, interactions are what makes aggregation interesting and different from a simple sum. So let's think about how you might see interactions between the learners by looking at the simplest possible organization one can imagine, which is just two actors. Okay, it's still an organization. It's a multi-agent system. Let's say they have some collective goal. So it is an organization. So we now have these very two simple actors, each doing their learning by doing cycles on their own. How can I create interactions between them? So one way I might do that is to actually have the beliefs of this actor be influenced by the beliefs of this actor, right? So this would be something that we might think of as knowledge transfer or belief transfer. This is a kind of vicarious learning. So I'm forming my beliefs, right, independent of my own outcomes and actions, because it's coming directly from the other actor. So this is a kind of vicarious learning. So an example would be, back to the question that Andrea was asking, do I need to go through the trial and error process of discovering how to do long division on my own by trying out different ways of doing long division, getting feedback and improving my beliefs? Or can I have an experienced person like a teacher who's already done this and is able to transfer their beliefs into my mind? That's a form of vicarious learning through belief transfer or knowledge transfer, knowledge exchange. Okay, this is one way in which I can see an interaction between these two. Another way in which an interaction might occur is if I can actually observe the actions and outcomes of the other actor, right? So this is me, or this is some lady here, and she's actually able to observe the actions and outcomes of the other person. So this is called observational learning. So think about success-based copying. Suppose I see people around me and I see what actions they're taking and I'm seeing their outcomes. Okay, I don't have to take any actions or outcomes myself, but if I can observe yours, I can learn from that, and I might want to imitate the actions of the people who are performing the best because I see their actions, I see their outcomes. That's also a form of vicarious learning. Okay, but we're not directly talking to them. We're not exchanging beliefs. We're actually just looking at their actions or outcomes, and this is called observational learning. The second kind of learning, which is an interaction between these actors. Okay, so this is a second form of aggregation, if you like. You can break that up. You can imagine a case where I can only see the actions. and I copy them. Or I can imagine a case where I only see the outcomes. I don't see the actions of the other. And these are also forms of vicarious learning. If I only see the actions of the other and I copy them, this is called imitation, right? I'm just imitating what they're doing. If I only see the outcomes and I don't see the actions, this might still affect my own learning cycle through what we might call inspiration. Why inspiration? Because I see that they're doing very well, right? I don't know how they're getting there, but they are getting very good results. I'm not getting there. So maybe this is going to inspire me to try harder, maybe to explore more, maybe to search further, right? So all of these are forms of interaction between the actors, which is coming from vicarious learning. These are all forms of vicarious learning. But they're quite different if you think about what is actually moving between the two actors. This is why it starts paying off to pay attention to what is being aggregated exactly here. So with these two actors, we could have an exchange of beliefs, an observation on both actions and outcomes, or an observation on just actions or just outcomes. Okay, these are all forms of vicarious learning. There's one more class of interaction, which is actually quite interesting, which is I might not exchange beliefs. Okay, I might not observe your actions. I might not observe your outcomes, but still there's an interaction between the two players because of dependence, by which I mean the outcome that I get for my action also partly depends on the action of the other. Okay, so think about competitive interactions in the market. I set a price for my product and I look at my profits. But that's not the whole story, right? I choose a price, I get a profit, but the profit also depends on what price my competitors have set. So I'm not talking to them. In fact, I might not even be allowed to talk to them because of antitrust conditions or things like that. I might not observe directly the prices that you are setting. I might only be able to guess that. In industrial context, for instance, prices are not transparent, right? I can't actually see the price. I don't even know what your profitability is. But I just know that my realized demand and therefore my profitability is going to depend on some action of you as well as some action of me. That's in a competitive context. I can imagine the same thing in a non-competitive context within an organization, right? So suppose we are engineers working on different parts of a complex system. So I'm developing the software, you're developing the hardware, and together the product goes out in the market and either the prototype is successful or it's not. So the signal I get on the quality of the effort I put into writing the software is partly telling me about my effort in writing the code, but it's also dependent on the quality of your hardware, right? So there are dependencies between the two actors here, which is another form of interaction. And this is called coupled learning. This is different from vicarious learning, right? So vicarious learning is where I either transfer the beliefs or I observe the actions or the outcomes, but there is no dependency in the actions itself. Or there could be coupled learning where I don't transfer beliefs, I don't observe actions, don't observe outcomes, but our payoffs that we are each receiving, the outcomes we are getting, are conditional on the actions of the other. Is that a form of social learning as well? Yes, right? Except here, the two actors who are learning from each other in the social system may not even be aware that the other exists. Okay, they don't need to be. But the feedback they are getting is partly contingent on the behavior of others in the social system. So it is a form of social learning. So to summarize these different forms of learning, I'm going to draw on a table from a paper that Sangyun and I are working on called the Micro Foundations of Vicarious Learning. These are different forms of vicarious learning that I just showed you in those two pictures. So the pure belief sharing case, the first row is where I go directly from here to here. And examples of that can be found in these papers. There's some empirical, some theory papers here. You can get observational learning where I can see both action and outcome. So this is the case where I observe both the action and the outcome across the actors. And there are examples of that. There could be just action, which is pure imitation. A lot of empirical work has actually been focused on that. There could be just outcome, which is pure inspiration. And there's a lot of work on that as well, right? So all of these are really forms of vicarious learning. And in addition to this, we might also have the case where none of this is happening, right? We're not actually either transferring beliefs or we're not observing beliefs, we're not observing actions, we're not observing outcomes. But because of the links between our actions, what can be happening is that whenever I do something and I get some feedback on it, partly the outcome also depends on the actions of the others. This is called coupled learning. So these are the two broad kinds of interactions really between actors. So there's vicarious or social learning, in which the key interaction between actors is influence, right? So the belief of J depends on I, independent of J's own outcomes. Or they could be coupled learning, where the outcome of J, taking an action, depends on the action of I. Okay? And of course, both things could be going on at the same time. All right. So I want you to just pause for a second and think about how much more complicated this has become, even though I've just added one more actor into the system. All right. Yes, the size of the organization has increased by 100%. We went from one to two actors, but just with two actors compared to one, you can already see that the learning cycles, because of their linkages between them, can become very complicated. Okay. And this is one of the reasons why I think modeling has been quite helpful to understand these coupled learning and vicarious learning processes, because you're trying to model two learning cycles which are linked in some way, either by the exchange of beliefs or by the observation of actions or outcomes or both. And they can also be dependencies between actors. These things can be going on together, can be going on separately. How on earth would we keep track of all this complexity if we didn't have some formal structure to bear it in mind, right? Empirically, I think having this at the back of your head can be very helpful because you know what to look for. So are we measuring the exchange of beliefs? Are we measuring what people are observing in terms of actions, in terms of outcomes? Or is there no direct interaction between the actors, but there is coupling, right? Because of dependency between actions. These differences, if you have in mind, I think can sharpen the way we do empirical work. Okay, so let me pause there and see if I can take any questions or answer any clarifications at this point. Go ahead, Ramesh.
Thank you, Professor. I am new to this area of research, but I am trying to square it with the works of the likes of Nonaka, who is a founder of my school, in knowledge management, where he talks about tacit versus explicit knowledge and how the interaction between tacit and explicit leads to creation of new knowledge. Now, the example that you've given here, I was curious as to how this squares with that.
So one way to think about tacit knowledge is that it's the kind of knowledge that is difficult to directly transfer beliefs between actors. Right? It's going to be quite difficult to imagine taking my beliefs, my understanding of the world, and directly transplanting it into your head if a lot of what I know is itself tacit. Okay. So one translation of the notion of tacit knowledge into this way of thinking about it, the way I've been talking about it, is to say this mechanism of vicarious learning is ruled out when knowledge is tacit. Okay. Or maybe it still happens, but in a very imperfect manner. Maybe we're not able to translate our beliefs very precisely or completely across each other. Another way to think about it is that the only channels open are, this is ruled out, but you could still possibly learn by observing actions or by observing outcomes or some combination of these. Okay? So this question of tacit versus explicit, I think, can be thought of as the richness or not of the channels between the actors in these pictures that I'm showing.
As a follow-up question, do you think there's also a time element here in terms of learning? Because tacit learning, when it's made explicit, technically it takes much longer to learn compared to beliefs or actions which may be easily translatable or readable or decipherable.
That could well be. So one way to interpret that is that the efficacy of transfer of beliefs is not very high. So you need multiple cycles of this for it to happen. Right? So that could well capture exactly what you're saying. So yeah, that would be a nice way to think about it.
Thank you.
Sankeet?
Thanks, Phanish, for this. So I think it's just very interesting. So you're saying basically, I think the point that you're trying to make here is that when you go from individual learning to organizational or aggregate learning, then learning outcomes can be different. And I think a lot of what you're talking about is, and right here at least, is that adding another person to the story increases perhaps the opportunity to learn. But also in conjunction with that, I think we also have to think about probably the motivation or ability to learn from others. And I wonder, what your thoughts about that. Is that the direction that we want to go here, or is more the point trying to understand what happens when you add another person to the story?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is exactly what I'm going to end on when I talk about context versus aggregation. Right. So far I've been looking at just pure mechanical aggregation. So I could replace these people in my picture with computational agents right? And these agents don't know whether they're alone in this world or they're living in a society of agents. They act in the same way all the time. But their behavior will look different, even though their rules of behavior are the same, because the inputs they are now getting are different, right? If there was only one of these actors as Robinson Crusoe in their little world, even though the rules of behavior are the same, the results they produce look different. But if I put them in a group, in a swarm, because they can also observe each other's beliefs and actions, even though their rules of internal processing are the same, their behaviors can look different. What you're adding is the next level, which is what if their rules of behavior change because they are in a social context, right? And absolutely correct. And this is exactly the difference between human beings and these computational agents, right? So that's what I mean by a context effect. And I think we need to investigate carefully the difference between that and a pure aggregation effect, right? We don't often tease these apart very cleanly empirically, but that's where we want to go.
Thank you.
Ekaterina?
So yeah, another question which I have is regarding, well, yeah, so here in coupled learning, it's assumed that there is a dependence, a kind of a sequential dependence, right, between agent I and J, and they expect that I will use maybe output produced by agent J as agent I in my work. But what about the situations when we have like complex novel problems where interdependencies between different agents and different tasks are not very clear from the start, and it will be discovered gradually over time, and maybe you will find out that actually you could have used input from a certain agent. But will it be an example of vicarious learning that becomes coupled learning, or what will it be the case of?
So just to clarify, there is no assumption that the actions are sequential or not here, right? They don't have to be. So they can be simultaneous, they can be sequential. What matters is that the signal on outcome that I get for my action is partly determined by the actions of the other. So that could happen simultaneously, or maybe it's in sequence, but I only get the final signal after the other person has acted. That doesn't really make a difference to the story here. The key point really is the outcome I see is conditioned on others' actions, right? And in fact, the question you're raising about what happens when I'm not aware about this is exactly the right and interesting question, because that's probably what happens very often in complex social systems like organizations. So often our outcomes are dependent on other people's actions, but we don't know how, right? And this can mean that we are at risk of things like superstitious learning. So I might do A on Monday and I get a good outcome, and I do A again on Tuesday, but now I don't get a good outcome. Why? Because there's coupled learning going on in the background, but I don't know this, right? So in these systems where there's a lot of coupling, there's a risk that one overlearns from the outcome that we see, because we're not really aware that that outcome is partly being driven by other people's actions. So that is exactly the problem of dependency creating potentially superstitious learning. And one of the way organization design can solve that problem is to try and make people aware of these dependencies. So the agents are less reactive to their feedback. They know that they're partly getting signals based on what others are doing. So I need to kind of tune down my rate of adjustment to the outcome or the signal. That could be a design intervention. Or maybe I re-engineer the work so that you go from a situation of dependence to no dependence, right? So that the learning can become a lot easier. So that's exactly where we want to go once we understand how aggregation works at this very micro level. When we start thinking about design interventions, that's the direction we have to go.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Phanish.
Okay. Norman?
Thank you, Phanish. Sorry for coming back to the question of processing, but that's just like still I'm trying to get to understand this. Like, for example, like in a corporate headquarters, as you gave the example of capital budgeting. So for example, like there is a committee, if one person is assigned the task of allocating budget to 5 divisions. So one person is dealing with all the information that is coming from 5 divisions. Now, let's say there is the size of the committee is expanded to 2 or 3 people. Now, there is one thing that their beliefs could be influenced by each other, but there is another possibility that the beliefs are the same, but like the same information is now being processed in a much better way, because first, like one person had to handle all the information and it was coming to they are coming to a different conclusion. And now everything else could remain the same, but it is just like, because there are two people, like they are able to process the pieces of information. So like how we can differentiate this from the aggregation effect.
What you're describing seems like a particular form of aggregation, right? What's happening there is that the beliefs are being exchanged and maybe back and forth. I just drew the arrow in one direction here, but there's no reason why it can't go back, right? Maybe it goes in both directions. And through their pooling of beliefs, they might even get better beliefs. There might be some error cancellation, or there might be some improvement or refinement or recombination of beliefs. So many things can happen in the exchange of beliefs, right? I'm not ruling any of that out. I'm just pointing out that these are all ultimately going to have to come in one of these flavors. So either I've got to be connecting beliefs, I've got to be observing actions or outcomes, or both, or there's going to be coupling at the level of the dependencies. It can't be anything beyond these basic things. But there can be more complicated versions of each one of these things.
Thank you so much for clarifying.
Okay. Manuel?
Yeah, thanks, Phanish. I'm curious. So I very much appreciate, this effort to start like the micro building blocks and then kind of aggregating it up, right? But I have to wonder, so it's at what point, from a potentially more empirical, perspective, does this approach just run into overwhelming complexity, right? I mean, you're mentioning this yourself, right? Already just influencing two actors, looking at like the potential interactions between all the different errors, it's becoming so complex. So I'm just kind of closetly a little bit arguing for more sociological perspective here. At what time should we really like approach a top-down perspective, right? Because even the beliefs are not going to be exogenous, right? They're going to be endogenously shaped, right? So there's like strong I don't know if top-down is even like the right conceptual frame, but you know what I mean, right? Exogenous kind of influences on the individual, right? So like maybe it's, you see my point, right? Like my question is more from a more meta, from an explanatory perspective, right? At what time does this kind of effort to build up or explain from the bottom up break down, and what time should we really adopt more of a top-down approach?
Right. Okay. So just to be clear, I haven't said anything yet about explaining bottom up or top down. I'm simply pointing out that there are these distinct mechanisms at work in the aggregation of learning processes. Okay. Now, I don't think you are saying we should give up distinguishing these mechanisms. We should distinguish these mechanisms, right? Because there are clearly empirical situations where we can exchange beliefs, and there are empirical situations where we can't. We rely on observation or imitation or inspiration or things like that. So far, all I'm saying is these different mechanisms are at work. Now, let's get to the question of how do you move from dyads to larger systems of interaction between actors? And for that, we have the standard toolkit of social science, which is networks, right? That's exactly what these network models are doing. So this is, of course, the wonderful paper by Fang, Li, and Schilling, okay? And it is a model of vicarious learning through observation, not belief exchange. It's a model of vicarious learning through observation. So now we can actually reverse it and say, this is a macro model with networks and all kinds of interactions between multiple actors. But if you want to understand what's really going on, in each link is basically the ability of each actor to observe the outcome and action of the other, and then do success-based copying by adopting the behaviors of the best performing actor, right? So we already have the answer to the question, how do we go from the dyad to the multi-actor system? We do it through networks. Now, in their paper, they actually don't have dependency. They don't have coupled learning. They have only vicarious learning. There's a recent paper that Özgecan Koçak, Dan, and I have just got accepted in Org Science, where we show how to use the same network structure to model both the spread of interactions in the form of vicarious learning, as well as dependencies among actors, right? So the point isn't that we stop at the dyad. The point is, if we are not clear about the mechanisms at the dyad, then at the aggregate level, we're just going to get a mess. So we want to be super clear about what's going on at the dyadic level and then aggregate upwards using the machinery of computation. Now, independent of that, I think you're raising a point about top-down causation. Okay, that's a very interesting question. So everything I've said so far is very much like, just we see aggregate effects through the interaction of actors, whether it's 2 or 100, doesn't matter. But no actor is changing their behavior in response to the global state of the system. That's top-down causation, right? That is exactly what I call context. So that's where we're going to end up at the end of this discussion, to say there's the aggregation effect where the actors are just acting as if they are completely autistic. It just happens they are now next to another actor, so things change, but they don't change how they act. Compare that to a case where actors are taking into account the global signal, the global state of the system, and therefore changing their rules of behavior. That's a context effect. So we will end exactly there, right? But hopefully you get the point that we want to start at the dyad level, not because we think the world is dyadic. But if you're not even clear at the dyad level, then at the macro level, we're just talking big words with no traction to reality, right? That's really the point that we're saying. Yeah. Philip.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed the discussion. I think it's very informative. And I have a quick question related to prediction. So we know from neuroscience that how we evaluate an outcome, that we make a prediction and we look at the outcome and look at the delta in between. Where do you see predictions in your model? Is it the same as a belief, or is it a link that links beliefs and outcomes?
So the discrepancy between belief and outcome is prediction error. So the essence of reinforcement learning or individual learning by doing is actually prediction error driven, right? And that prediction error is exactly the distance between my belief and the outcome that I receive. So it is quite central to this framework. Again, I might refer you to the resources on the modeling course, where we actually explore this idea of prediction error being central to all kinds of associative learning and how they are formalized in different models of organizational learning. Okay. Garima?
Thank you so much for this session. It is really informative. So my question is, are we assuming, while even in a dyadic relationship, are we assuming that we actually know what is leading to what, as in which belief is leading to which action and which action is leading to which outcome? Are we sure of that, or are we taking into account the causal ambiguity which might be there? Even in a dyadic relationship, because we have multiple beliefs and that can lead to multiple actions, or there might be multiple outcomes. So that is my question. Are we taking into account causal ambiguity, or are we assuming that we know what leads to what?
So just to be clear, when I say beliefs here, the beliefs can be completely false. So there is nothing in this learning cycle, formulation, which assumes that beliefs are accurate. Beliefs could be superstitious, they could be wrong, they could be incomplete, they could be partial. But what we do assume is that given your beliefs, however poorly specified or incomplete they are, you derive certain actions based on them. Okay. Yes. And then based on those actions, the environment produces some feedback, and that leads to an updating of the belief process. But at no stage are we assuming this updating is perfect, nor these beliefs are accurate, nor do you strictly follow your actions from your beliefs, because that's what exploration is, right? Where you ignore your current beliefs and take slightly different actions. So none of this is mechanically driven by, a one-to-one lockstep relationship. It's probabilistic, and none of it has to be accurate.
Okay. So when I'll be learning from somebody vicariously, I will have to take into account that there might be false negatives or false positive.
Absolutely. There is no guarantee what I'm learning is accurate, right? That's absolutely correct.
Thank you so much.
Jose.
Yeah, Phanish, I had a question. Just because the framework that you have here of beliefs, actions, and outcomes is very similar to one that I had in the first decision science course that I attended. But instead of outcomes, it has goals, and outcomes would be merged with actions. So the idea was that if you know the goals and the beliefs of someone, you know what they're going to do. Or if you know the goals and the actions they're taking, you know what they believe. And that was very foundational in that course. And here you're sort of taking goals away. Where does goal go in this model that you have here?
So goals live somewhere between beliefs and actions, right? So obviously your actions depend on your understanding of the world and your goal structure. So goals, if I had to draw it somewhere, would live somewhere over here. Okay, we could explicitly represent goals in this process, if you like, right? Where we could be also refining our goals, or we could simply assume goals remain constant in these learning cycles. So this is an additional complication that one might want to bring in. I consciously chose to kind of suppress that for now, but you could simply assume that what I'm saying, or you could imagine what I'm saying is our goals don't change. We want to get the best possible cumulative outcomes over time, right? Like in a bandit task, or the highest peak in a landscape in an NK model. So that doesn't change. But how to get there is going to be conditioned then on our belief structure about the world. And that's the part that we're focusing on in the learning cycle. Okay. All right, great timing. So that brings us to the last part of what we want to talk about. Well, there are a couple of terminological points that I also want to just raise. It's not super important, but it's jargon that you might see in this world. And it's good to know. So sometimes you'll come across this difference between online and offline learning. Okay, and just useful to know what this is. Learning by doing is online learning, right? And it's same as learning from experience and trial and error learning. These are all synonyms. And it's called online because your experiences arise from direct and costly interaction with the environment. That's why it's called online, right? You're paying a cost directly of interacting with the environment. It could be an opportunity cost if you have limited opportunities for interaction, but that's online learning. Offline learning is when there's no direct interaction with the environment. You can get the things you need to learn from others through vicarious learning. It's a form of offline learning. Or if you have a reasonably good model of the world, you could prototype or you could simulate, right? So what is prototyping or simulation in a computer? Like when you are building a computer model of an organization, you're learning about the world without actually directly acting on the world. Therefore, it's less costly, right? It's less directly expensive. And it depends entirely on the quality of your model of the world. If you have a good model of the world, then the simulation is good. If the simulation is not a good representation of the world, then offline learning is not very effective. Okay? But this distinction between online and offline learning sometimes comes up in our literature. And learning by doing is very much a classic online learning process. Okay? You directly pay the cost through each period of interaction and act directly on the task environment. Another related distinction, which is not as explicit, which I wish it was, is that organizations also, of course, come in different flavors. Okay? And at a very basic level, one difference that matters enormously is whether we are talking about a team or a committee. The distinction here is in a team, every member acts directly on the task environment. Okay, that's what I've been talking about so far. So all the pictures I've shown you, the two agents, the networks, they're all teams. But there is, of course, a class of behavior where organizations are really committees. So there are multiple actors. Each of them might still have their learning cycle, but the aggregate action of the organization is going to be determined by a vote or something like a vote, right? If it's vote, then it's decentralized. In the end, maybe the vote is weighted and one individual has the final say, like a CEO or a top management team leader or a board of directors, with a primary actor who's leading the board of directors in some sense. But in all these cases, what's also happening here is that the decision of the organization itself is aggregated from the actions of the individuals. And we have some wonderful papers in our field already which have dealt with these sorts of issues. So think about Torbjørn Knudsen and Michael Christensen's work, right, on screening functions. So there's no direct learning in their basic model. It's just static decision making, but different ways of combining the team members, either in sequence or in parallel, leads to a different aggregate committee decision, right? Or think about Felipe Chazar's work, right? Some great papers with J.P. Eggers and also his more recent paper with Ostler is a kind of offline learning process where different members in the committee are getting cues from the environment. So it's not learning by doing, right? There's no action in the world. It's offline, and it's essentially a supervised learning problem, right? They're fitting regression models. But what matters in their model is the aggregation of those different learners into a final committee decision, either through a vote or by one person making a choice. More directly applicable to what we've been talking about is a very nice recent paper. This date is wrong. It should be 2021, not 2012. So this is Henning Pidzunka, Vikas Agarwal, and Hart Posen. A lovely paper just came out in Org Science, where they actually study what happens when committees are doing learning by doing. Okay? And very interesting point they make, and I think is worth bearing in mind, is that in a committee, each person might have a different view on what the committee should do, but in the end, there's going to be a majority vote, right? Now, the feedback from the task environment is only going to be provided on the action the committee finally decided on, which means there are going to be people on the committee who didn't win the vote, right? They're the minority, who can continue to believe that if only these idiots on the committee listened to me and did what I wanted them to do, we would have gotten a great outcome. But we never did that, right? Because I was in the minority. So their illusions can perpetuate for very long periods. So you can have these minorities with these illusions about what's the right thing to do, which never get tested because they're the minority. So this is an additional layer of complication created by the aggregation process because it's a committee. right? In the end, you only test one action, which is the resultant of the voting or some other decision-making process, which produces one action. We've been talking so far really about the case of teams where the actions are fully disaggregated. All right, let's move on to the very last point I want to make. And Sankey already kind of prefigured this a little bit. So what do I mean by this aggregation versus context effects distinction? This is it really, right? So we have these actors who are each running through their own learning cycles, and they have their own parameters. So the rate at which I convert my outcome into beliefs, how much I explore when I go from belief to action, to what extent I clearly observe outcomes based on action. These are individual level parameters and can be different across people. A pure aggregation effect is one where I don't change any of these parameters. So I learn in the same way. Given the outcome that I receive, I update my beliefs at the same rate. And I do that whether I'm alone, sitting in a room on my own, or I'm in a group. So I'm kind of a, quasi-autistic type character. I'm not really changing my behavior in response to social phenomena. But even if we kept our behavior identical, the very fact that now part of my outcome is going to depend on the action of the other through coupled learning, or I'm getting inputs into my beliefs from others' beliefs, or I'm observing others' outcomes or observing others' actions, this is going to change my outcome, right? My final result is going to look different. My learning cycle is going to look different. This is pure aggregation. A more behaviorally plausible way of looking at the problem might be that it's not just aggregation. I'm also going to change the way I update my beliefs because I am in a social context. Right? So Sankey referred to the idea that maybe I work harder, I'm more motivated because I see there's another guy here. So what would that mean in this context? Maybe I run through these cycles faster. Maybe I'm more motivated to explore. Maybe I update my beliefs more strongly because I'm in a group as opposed to being in an individual, off on my own. So these are contextual effects, right? It could be that I'm responding to the aggregate performance of the entire system. This is the top-down causation question that Emmanuel was raising. So I change the rate at which I update, I change the rate at which I explore, I change the linkage between action and outcome because I look at some aggregate property of the system. So let me give a reference to a model that I think everybody would be familiar with, even if you don't work with models. So everybody knows Schelling segregation, the Thomas Schelling model of segregation, right? So in the basic Schelling segregation model, actors only do aggregation. There's no context effect. I just look in my local neighborhood, and if there are enough people of my color, I stay. Otherwise, I switch, right? Now imagine that these actors in Schelling segregation became a little bit more conscious about the global state of the system. So they read in the newspaper that their neighborhoods are getting very segregated. They said, oh, that's not very good. I don't want to live in a highly segregated neighborhood. So I'm going to change my threshold. So instead of having only half my neighbors be the same color, I'll settle for 1/4. Okay. So I'm changing my rule of behavior in response to the global property of the system. That's a context effect. Okay. So these are the two ways really in which organizational learning ultimately is going to be different from individual learning. Either there's going to be this pure aggregation effect just by either through vicarious learning or coupled learning or some combination of these, or it's going to be this contextual effect where my own behavior as a learner is different because I'm in a social system versus I'm not. That's it really. It's not more complicated than that in my view. At the core of all the complication is the fact that aggregation has to come down in learning to some combination of these things. But of course, how these aggregate up into larger systems, right, can be complicated. We need tools like networks. We need tools like maybe computational modeling. If you're doing theory, or if you're doing empirical work, we really need very clear kind of conceptualization and measurement of what's the kind of interaction we're trying to track. What are the predictions we are testing? But at the core, I think this basic set of ideas is the toolkit. That's how we think about aggregation. So let me stop there and see if there are any more questions in the remaining few minutes we have left. Go ahead, Mario.
A quick one here. You said you were working on this paper on vicarious learning, right? This is not published yet.
This one is not. There is a version of the model that's already published. That was in the pre-readings, the paper in complexity.
Right.
So there's a simpler version of the model, but we have extended it a lot and kind of expanded on these different mechanisms of vicarious learning in a separate project. That one is under review, but I'm happy to share a working paper.
Oh, okay. I'll let you know. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Okay, Jisoo, go ahead.
One of the questions that I have with like assumption occurs during lecture is that I was wondering, like, as far as I understood, your assumption is that the members in the organization, they're like both motivated and capable of to aggregate and learn. But like in reality, I think that they're like they have different levels of like motivation and capabilities. So is it because the empirical like challenge that you have, or is it like the basic underlying assumption of this whole aggregate learning literature? Like that was what I was wondering about.
Yeah, so in everything I've said, I've kind of just assumed that motivation levels are constant and not different across actors. But you could easily relax that assumption, right? So the simple question to ask is, suppose people are more or less motivated to learn. Where will it show up in the learning cycle? So one obvious place it might show up is I just do fewer of them. So given the same time, I might run through fewer cycles than you. Another place it might show up is that the extent to which I update my beliefs based on feedback might be much lower compared to somebody who's highly motivated, right? Or another place it might show up is if I'm not motivated, I'm maybe not attentive enough, then I don't take my beliefs seriously into account when choosing actions. I kind of choose at random. So there are different places where motivation may play a role, but I haven't mentioned those explicitly, but I think you'll still find the learning cycle helpful to ask where in that process is the effect of motivation going to be visible.
So just a follow-up question. In terms of capabilities, too, like there's a room for expertise to get into model, or is it the case, or?
So where is expertise in these learning cycles? That's what you're asking?
Yeah, yes.
That's the improvement over time between the match between your beliefs and reality. That's expertise.
Okay, got it.
Right? That's learning by doing. So you become an expert by doing, and that's how your beliefs get better over time. Ekaterina and then Philip. Emmanuel, please cut us short when we are out of time. I don't have a time constraint, but if you think we are going too far, then you can tell us to stop.
Well, just so everyone knows, I mean, we have Dan Leventhal's session in half an hour.
Okay.
So if everyone is okay with it, I mean, we can keep it running, Phanish. So it's more on your burden is on you to just say stop, you know.
No, I'm very happy to. I know I've thrown a lot of material in a very concise time frame. I just want to make sure at least the core ideas are coming through clearly. So any questions, clarifications, most welcome.
No, well, that's great. So then I suggest we just leave it open, but you know, everyone know that like we come back in half an hour, you know, but so we just have a more free-flowing, real conference type situation. All right, great, thanks.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, Ekaterina.
Yes, so by the end of the lecture, I realized that I stopped understanding what aggregation means, because then you introduce these contextual effects, and so I got really confused. So aggregation as a term, it's very new for me. So how would you determine it exactly in order to separate from contextual effects?
Okay, so think about it like this. Let's say that, you know, there are two people, each of whom has some style of learning or some way of learning. So they have their own ways of managing their learning cycle. So you have your way of doing it. Philip, let's say, has his own. Okay. Now, if you were operating independently in two different rooms, there's no aggregation. You're just operating independently. But suppose I allowed either vicarious learning or coupled learning between the two of you, then there is aggregation. Now, on top of that, if it turns out that you and Philip actually change the way your learning cycles operate, because now you are in the presence of each other through some kind of a competition effect or a peer effect or a motivation effect, then that's context. So you can have simple aggregation without any contextual change, or you can have aggregation along with some kind of a contextual change because we are in a social context.
And contextual would imply that both of us are changing the...
At least one of you. Yeah.
At least one. Okay. And then I have another question. So regarding the, maybe you could suggest any of the courses that, I could follow or enroll in the new academic year, where this modeling and testing of models for organizational learning and search are provided and explained, so that I learn it myself as well.
So the links I gave to the modeling organizational learning course, I think will cover the modeling side of it. not necessarily the empirical side of it, but the modeling side, I think you'll get pretty much everything you need to get started building your own model. So in that class, you're actually required to replicate some existing papers. So, we have code on GitHub that you can use if you want to get a start, but that's a good resource for starting. There are also some papers referred in that course, which I think are great places to start thinking about empirical work in this area, particularly lab-based empirical work, right? Because as you can see, if you really want to get to these mechanisms at a micro level, it can be quite useful to study these things in the behavioral lab. So I don't do that sort of work, or not much yet, but there are some very nice papers by Stefan Billinger and colleagues, by Thorbjørn Gunnarsson and Michael Christensen and others. So those references are in those syllabi as well. So you might want to start there.
You referred to links that were provided in the syllabus.
Ekin or Sangin, would you just mind putting the links to the modeling org learning class? If you just give the first of the YouTube links, I think all of them are embedded within that. So you can just click through and find the rest.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you very much, Phanish.
Sure. Hi, Philip.
Yeah, and so again, really interesting. The thing that I have when I think about the aggregation from the individual to at least the team level or the diet, I have the feeling that some core assumption of the learning cycle can break down. I would love to hear your thoughts. Probably I don't understand it well, but let's think about the assumption is that the outcome updates the belief. But I think a social situation can lead to the situation where the belief is more important than updating anything or improving. So, for example, I'm in a competitive situation, the outcomes are there and they're somewhat ambiguous, and it's important for me to not update my belief in order to sustain my position within this diet or this competition or whatever. So I would love to hear your thoughts on it, because I think it is interesting to think about a situation where the typical cycle could break down. I think a situation where more than one individual is present would be a good contester.
I think so. So I think I'm thinking of exactly the kind of situation you're describing as a contextual effect. So my updating rate might collapse to 0 in a social context, right? So think about some version of threat rigidity. So some effect like that might actually cause me to stop learning, which means effectively my learning cycle has stopped. And that I see as a kind of contextual effect. That would never happen if I put two computational agents in a learning system, right? Because they have no feelings, but humans do. So they might actually change the way they learn and adapt from each other just because they are in a social context. So I think it's quite consistent with what you're saying. That can happen.
Okay, yeah, I think I need to think more about the contextual factor. It's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Ramesh?
Thank you so much for your presentation. As someone who has not been exposed to this area of research, your presentation and lecture was extremely useful. I wanted to go back to a point that I was discussing previously about time. And I was wondering how time could incorporate and possibly even accentuate this whole belief action outcome process, because I was wondering if say and I'm thinking how I can articulate this better. Say for example, if there's some kind of a temporal proximity with respect to acquiring the learning or the search and the belief, and leading up to the outcome. If there is a closer time space between these two, versus if the outcome is much beyond, or the action is much delayed compared to the learning acquired, that I think could potentially change how the belief even gets used in the first place, or how the action might eventually even have any effect on the outcome. And also the second thing is organizational beliefs, as you were mentioning, that it's that learning can happen within the organization itself without having to undergo the search process, which then I would guess is an accumulation of past experiences, which inevitably entails another time dimension, which is the weakening of learning, and then reinforcement of learning, potentially through things like training programs or revisiting I don't know, corporate mythology, or things like that, or some kind of a vision sharing exercise. So I was wondering how time can be incorporated into this that we discussed today.
Yeah. So there's no reason why the arrows between the steps of the learning cycle, right, that have to be all equidistant or equally, spaced out in time. Okay, they can unfold over different periods, and as a consequence, you may absolutely see things like forgetting. You may see things like decay, memory decay of various kinds. You might see a weak updating because the time lag between the outcome and the action and the outcome is very large. This is all possible, right? I haven't said anything about those things because these are each like whole topics unto themselves, because I was focusing more on aggregation. But what you could do is start with the learning cycle and start asking what happens as the gaps between the steps in the cycle get larger or smaller. Okay, and this is not blank slate. There's a very nice literature already out there which looks at questions of organizational memory, organizational retention, codification, attention. Each of these is huge literatures, and you're going to see many of those from the scholars in the academy over the next few weeks, right? So you might want to think about the role of time as the extension or the shortening of the arrow length between the steps, and ask yourself how that's going to change the learning cycle. I think that's a fruitful way of thinking about the problem.
Thank you so much. I'll look up the references as suggested.
Thank you. Claudia.
Yes, so as Philip was asking a question, I realized that there is something I didn't understand. So, I mean, this cycle seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, that it's informational in nature, so that I gather more information and I learn from it. Do preferences come in at any stage? Like, for instance, with social aspirations, there is something that relates risk to decisions, but where do preferences come in the picture in this framework?
So this is, I think, similar to Jose's question about where are the goals in the learning cycle, right? So there is no explicit statement of goal here, because the assumption is the goal remains one of maximizing cumulative outcome or payoff or something like that, right? But that's a simplification. One can certainly imagine more complicated versions of the learning cycle where even your goals are subject to change over time. So are you open to endogenizing preferences? We can do that, right? We can create a learning cycle which actually changes your goals over time based on certain outcomes. In a very weak sense, that's what's already happening in probabilistic search. So in probabilistic search, what we're doing is we are looking at performance, and if it is above some aspiration, then we do nothing. And if it is below, then we do more extensive search. So in that sense, our goals are kind of in a binary mode of doing more search or not doing more search, conditional on aspiration. So these are complications that we can add on the learning cycle, right? But they will have to, in the end, capture something about the learning cycle. So you can't get away from that, is my point. You will have to introduce these as bells and whistles on top of that basic cycle. Okay, but you will still have to go through the basic cycle of belief, action, outcome if it's about learning, because that's how learning is defined. So I would suggest using that like a base case and then finding ways to add these things to think about what implication that has for observed organizational learning behavior. All right. Shubhabrata.
Hi, Phanish. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great. It's very informative and very helpful. So my current research is on innovation and knowledge transfer in global supply chains. So I was asking, so my question was, if you look at patent citations from, let's say, buyers or suppliers or even alliance partners, so what kind of learning would you classify those patent citations as?
They seem usually like some form of vicarious learning, right? Whether it is with belief exchange or observational learning is context dependent. I don't think it is coupled learning, right? That tends to be more the case in supply chains. So if upstream, downstream players, because they are coupled, there are dependencies there, I would suspect coupled learning is what's going on. But if it's between, players in the same industry observing each other's patenting behavior or product launches, that seems like more straightforward vicarious learning.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I think we've reached the end of the questions.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Phanish. A round of virtual or real world applause.
Thank you.
As everyone, I'm echoing everyone, it was like super clarifying, very informative. To everyone else, Dan Leventhal will join us in just about 20 minutes. So this is 5 o'clock if you're in Central Europe. So I suggest everyone just take a break, reflect a little bit, and then see you back here, in 15 minutes or so. Thank you so much, Phanish. And Phanish, I hope you're not too tight, and I hope you can join us for a little bit longer as well.
Just to say hi to Dan.
Great. Okay, cool.
Kind of
Thank you so much.
part of it.
Thank you so much, Phanish. That was fantastic. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.